Now we're moving on to our second panel, Contemporary Asian Diasporas, which will be chaired by Yechen Zhao. And Yechen is the Assistant Curator of Photography and Media at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I will welcome him to the podium now.
Thank you, Chelsea. Now you know who I am. The other interesting thing is that I was an undergraduate here about 12 years ago, so this is my second time back in this library. I'm happy to be here. I will introduce the panelists in turn. They'll come give their talks. Our first speaker is Genji Amino, who is a writer and curator based in New York City. They're also a PhD candidate in English literature at Columbia University. Their talk is, I think it is, The Transparency of Asian American Form. Genji, please come to the podium.
Thanks to the organizers of the conference, to Ellen and Rico, and thanks to you all for being here. This is sorry. Thank you. This is a kind of special and exciting context for me, I think, to be thinking about Asian and Asian American art and art history. And I think between A's performance yesterday and then these panels today, and there's so many kind of, I think, tacit questions and questions made explicit about the relationships between those histories, how we write those histories. And so I'm excited to be sharing some some thinking, some questions that I don't necessarily have the answers to, that are more about how we write Asian American art history, and are rather than this being an occasion for the writing of it. So I'm not going to be telling the story of a particular period or group of people, or this is my grandfather, Leo Amino, who's a Japanese American sculptor. I'm not going to be telling sort of his life story or anything like that, but I wanted to sort of begin with one of the very few examples that we have of his voice, the recordings of his voice and writing. And just ask ourselves some questions about what it might mean to reflect very broadly on where he's coming from. So dealing with transparency, one becomes very conscious of the effects of different kinds of light. How do we recall the voices of those for whom art history has never represented either a reliable record or the proper horizon of address? How do we share the news of an archive of experiment whose relationship to the contemporary continues to be compromised by an ongoing history of racial violence and colonial enterprise? What forms of intimacy, address, and refusal have yet to be imagined in and through this archive that exceed the prevailing art historical vocabularies for modernism, innovation, and abstraction? So these slides are more like a mood thing. I'm mostly just reading a paper, and I'm not going to be referring to any visuals, but the visuals, hopefully you can gather what the relationship is. So what I've just read were the first lines of a wall text printed at the entrance to Dead Lecturer, Distant Relative, Notes from the Woodshed, 1950 to 1980, an exhibition of Black and Asian American visual art and poetics that I organized at Columbia University's Wallach Art Gallery in July 2022.
The exhibition, whose title and critical framework drew on theorizations of the relationship between racial and aesthetic form, latent in the first full-length collection of poet Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka, as well as in the writings of Korean-American video artist, performer, and poet Teresa Hakyung Cha, and the studio log of painter Jack Whitten. So that's dead lecturer Leroy Jones, distant relative is Cha, and then Notes from the Woodshed is the posthumous publication of the studio log of Jack Whitten. This exhibition gathered an archive of Asian American and African American visual art and poetics produced over two successive generations following the Second World War in order to pose questions about the relationship between loss and kinship, history and memory, and race and abstraction. Addressing the ambivalent status of abstraction in relation to the essentializing receptions of works by artists arraigned under the sign of race, the exhibition aimed to provide alternatives to prevailing vocabularies for representation and resistance during the social movements of the 1960s and 70s, which have presupposed limited parameters of visibility for artists of color that persist today. Given the peculiar inaccessibility of Asian Americans to art history, that is, their relegation to being read either as emissaries of Asian traditions or assimilators of modern European and American artistic expressions, and I refer there to a 1997 exhibition, Asian Traditions, Modern Expressions, which is almost the only record in the last many decades of folks of a kind of broad survey of Asian American art in the United States, not including very recent kind of early surveys done at Stanford's Asian American Art Initiative. So given this peculiar inaccessibility of Asian Americans to art history, how can we learn to see Asian American artists as more than simply deputies of a modern project of civilization that in fact presumptively excludes them, to see them as more than agents of their own disappearance? These are additional slides for that exhibition. Impossible subjects. As descendants of those who history does not properly address, and perhaps for whom history cannot represent the proper horizon of address, the prospect of bearing witness to our ancestors always entails an entanglement in one manner or another with the ruses of memorialization, which often propose representation as a balm to the grief and dispossession rendered transparent through the conventions of a history written for the victor. When remembering the life and work of Japanese-American artists such as Ruth Asawa or my grandfather Leo Amino, who lived through the period of exclusion, containment, and extraction that culminated in the incarceration of 120,000 citizens and aliens of Japanese descent, that is, Ruth was evacuated as a Nisei citizen with her non-citizen parents from their truck farm in Norwalk, California, to Tanforan Assembly Center, and then incarcerated at Roa War Relocation Center in Arkansas, whereas my grandfather, who was not incarcerated, had immigrated as an Issei to the Bay Area at the onset of the Depression, but after 6 years of work as a schoolboy and farmer was spared the incarceration by his departure from the for the East Coast prior to the outbreak of the war. When thinking about these histories, we must observe the limits of conventional languages of commemoration to convey these histories of life and art, which have been rendered unrepresentable by official narratives or have otherwise been reserved. If the stories of those living through the period of anti-Japanese sentiment that culminated in the incarceration have represented an absent presence in conventional accounts of the post-war period, that is, events narratable only in the form of a contradiction in the terms of liberal democracy, America's concentration camps, the idea being that there's some contradiction between these things, which we know sort of in the contemporary moment, there's no contradiction between those things. This ambivalence does not present an exception, but rather a paradigmatic example of what has been described as the paradox of Asian American representation itself that has until recently made Asian American art an impossible subject for American history. Indeed, it was for this so-called Oriental problem that the incarceration camps imagined a solution in the civic impressment of a generation of Nisei into living proof of the universality of America. In my May 2022 exhibition, No Monument, in the wake of the Japanese-American incarceration at the Isamu Noguchi Foundation Garden and Museum, organized on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the Incarceration Executive Order 9066, I sought to respond to the ambivalent status of commemoration and memorialization of this historical trauma in light of the artistic experiments of Japanese-Americans whose silences, refusals, studies, and dreams persist in its wake. In the place of a romance of Asian American resistance or the pathos of Japanese American sacrifice, I sought to invite reflection on what it means to remember the ways in which such a formative event in Asian American history was rendered first unrepresentable, then unspeakable. In order to address the inscrutability that Asian American racial and aesthetic form presents for emplotment within American history, more is required than the commemorative redress of Asian American invisibility in the public sphere. That is, the belated inclusion of Toshiko Takezu, my grandfather, Keiseki Machi with this nylon hanging weaving, this belated inclusion, this redress of what's often spoken about as invisibility in the cultural sphere for Asian Americans, something more is required. For those figured in perpetual view of development, we must ask what form has been taken by civic impressment and what life remaindered. Put differently, we must learn to see the difference between invisibility and transparency. This section is called The Transparency of Asian American Aesthetic Form. My recent research examines the interanimation of social and art histories in post-war Asian American abstraction, taking up the figure of transparency as a potent analytic for racial and aesthetic form in the 20th century. I read against the grain a history of canonical artists and theorists in the tradition of the historical avant-garde, such as Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Walter Gropius, and Siegfried Gideon, who took up the notion of transparency as exemplary of modern paradigms of relation. I draw on recent work in Black and ethnic studies to develop frameworks for the reckoning of racial and aesthetic form against the grain of these canonical figures. If, for Martinican theorist and writer Edouard Glissant, it was necessary to theorize a right to opacity on behalf of the minorities swarming throughout the world, which was a refusal of and a refuge from the violence of what he called the reductive transparency of a generalizing universal. More recently, Denise Ferreira da Silva has theorized the violence of this Enlightenment ideal of transparency, not only in its incorporative and destructive effects for the racialized, but through its organization of the field of the racial in general as transparency's constitutive other. Whereas for Black art, in the wake of transatlantic slavery, Glissant's theorization of opacity has already been an invaluable resource for the refusal of colonial, disciplinary, and extractive grids of legibility imposed by this imaginary and disproportionately so among the descendants of slaves. A thinking of opacity as the interim between racial figures of impenetrable obscurity and transparent self-realization allows for the address of problems of recognition and representation across the positionalities purported to represent opposing ends of a racial landscape. Read in relation to the centrality of a language of invisibility to both contemporary popular discourse and influential critical accounts of Asian American life, especially in the cultural sphere, transparency becomes a complicating figure for the structural relations, incommensurabilities, and potentialities of Asian life and art within an American racial landscape. While in a moment of unprecedented attention to Asian American life and cultural production in the wake of the most recent developments of a centuries-old rhetoric of yellow peril and its attendant spectacle of anti-Asian violence, the figure of Asian American invisibility has emerged again as an explanatory figure for the status of Asian racial form in American political and social life. Unfortunately, this figure risks recapitulating the limits of a political horizon in which, as Vivian Huang writes, visibility has become the telos of Asian American public life and more broadly of US cultural politics, that visibility becomes kind of the limit of the horizon of political action. In this way, a fuller account of the positionality accruing to Asian American racialization has seemed to demand a critical vocabulary capable of addressing both the harm of being unseen and the constraints of the conditions of a visibility obtained only through nominal inclusion in the very narratives of human universality that would in fact presumptively exclude Asian Americans among other racialized groups. In contrast to the polarity of the framework governing the opposition between visibility and invisibility, the figure of transparency lends itself to the description of Asian American racial formation, which is historically positioned, in which Asian Americans are historically positioned as mediators between the modern figures of mastery and slavery, described variously as the partly colored or as junior members of civil society. Asian Americans shift between an adjacency to Blackness and honorary whiteness according to the dictates of a global political and libidinal economy. Moreover, such a reappropriation of this Enlightenment figure of this Enlightenment figure of transparency for the description of one of the very racial forms that it would tend to render invisible presents for us an opportunity for the recovery of this ideal's conceptual remainder, the conceptual remainder of the Enlightenment ideal of transparency. Transparency as a concept informs, but does not finally describe, the lived experience of its phenomenon. As the relative rather than absolute quality of perviousness to light, transparency is a limit concept interior to visibility, in the interim of the visible and the invisible, which serves to indicate not invisibility as such, but a zone of relative indeterminacy of appearance, as well as the potential to be seen through. Much like whiteness, transparency is, strictly speaking, an aesthetic and hygienic fantasy. There is no medium capable of eliding itself completely in the conveyance of a message, just as it is not only the problem of origin, but also that of transmission that plagues fantasies of racial purity. The perceptual phenomenon of transparency, then, gives the lie to the purity of the concept with which it shares its name, perennially describing and displaying its constitutive limits. Naming an entanglement with opacity rather than its polar opposite, the phenomenon of transparency indexes at once the failure of this limit concept and its potential for the description of other modalities of illumination. The Enlightenment ideal that renders Asian Americans invisible is in turn constitutive but not finally determinative of the ambivalent effects of transparency in Asian American life and art. Rather, these effects of transparency are at once affirmative and elusive to the racializing logics that produce them. As a figure for Asian American racial life, art, and Asian American life, art, and racial form, transparency illuminates both implication in technologies of enclosure and those modalities of openness that exceed them. It captures the simultaneous power and vulnerability of this intermediary position as a passage both to and for whiteness, while at the same time pointing to the remaindered life unaccountable to this racial calculus. Reciprocally, Asian American life and art serve to illuminate the persistent irreducibility of the medium of the Enlightenment's message. The transparent remainder of Asian American racial form reveals what is held in between, a reserve of insight and imagination for the reconstruction of relations of inside and outside, beyond those of possession and domination. Leo Amino, The Visible and the Invisible. For my grandfather, a sculptor who, to the best of our knowledge, introduces cast plastics into the history of American sculpture following the military declassification of polyester resin at the close of the Second World War, the question of transparency is at once what promises his visibility and his invisibility against the horizon of a historical narrative into and out of which he has passed, indeed, which has passed through him, without lasting notice. Art history, a liberal humanist descendant of more than one Enlightenment fantasy, and just as vulnerable to Glissant's critique of a colonial model of world building founded in precedence and filiation, deputized my grandfather in the middle of the 20th century as an exponent of modern sculpture, lending him a measure of visibility only insofar as this modernity could be discerned through his figure, and it did so only to lose sight of him. How can we allow Leo's life and work to illuminate the problems that this transparency of Asian American racial and aesthetic form has posed for this history, rather than simply establishing his inheritance within this history, and thereby reaffirming the parameters that would tend to render him invisible within it? When identity is not only something to be seen as visible or invisible, but to be seen through, how do we begin to see more clearly the contours of a wider racial landscape within and against which Asian American life and art is situated? When notions of spatial interior and exterior open out into questions of social, political, and ontological instantiation, how are the dimensions of this racial landscape rendered, and how might they be refracted? Rather than representing the inheritances of a philosophical idealism of the European avant-garde that has associated transparency with intellectual appropriation, as in constructivism, or sensuous possession, as in the work of Henry Moore, or, for that matter, rather than associating transparency with the proper, let me begin again. Rather than representing the inheritances of a philosophical idealism espoused by the European avant-garde, associating transparency with intellectual appropriation, as in constructivism, or sensuous possession, as in the work of Henry Moore, or for that matter, the properly American resistance to this same transparency that critics argue emerged in the post-war period through compositional strategies of radical discontinuity. Rather than either of these, Liu's work refuses altogether the Enlightenment conception of transparency as a technology of human power and knowledge over the natural world. Rather than the pursuit of transcendence of material realities, i.e. what Moholy-Nagy described as a search for pure abstraction through the freeing of material from its own weight, what had brought Liu to his experiments with transparency, on the contrary, was quite the opposite, an investigation into material intermediacy, what he described as a search for a way to employ color for sculpture that would come from within and not be a surface coating, a way to do this that was part of the material itself. What interested Liu was neither the promise of access to an objective order of things recommended by these Bauhaus emigres, nor the immediacy of the heroic expressionism of the American post-war avant-garde. Instead, Liu's inquiry into transparency sought to expose the spectral intimacies of displacement entailed by mediation. As he put it, quote, "Transparent form displaces space just as any other, yet the distinction between the physical aspect and the surrounding space is less conspicuous due to its transparency." Liu's preoccupation with this less conspicuous distinction evokes the interim at once occluded in transparency's concept and illuminated by the sensuous effects of transparency's experience. Not the utopia of a free, unmediated relation to the self or the world, the subject or the object, but the relational ramifications of mediation as such, an interim between that holds our seeing. Liu's castings and constructions expose an interstitial and yet interior spatiality displaced within the world. Submerged in a horizon of indeterminate depth on the inside of human occupation, Liu's works open an eye in the interim of its subject and object. His resin envelopes and chambers are interiors caught up in the exterior, giving the lie to transparency's incorporative fantasy and reserving a question about the structure of interiority as such in an anti-Black world where relations of possession and surrogacy reduce Blacks to a 0 degree of social conceptualization and reduce Asian Americans to an inscrutable surface. My grandfather's sculptures are open wounds of light. They're less object than medium, less enclosure than displacement. They do not imagine or invoke completion, but are modules of the partial and of the provisional. Their relationships to the outside are revealed as questions of the inside, their determinations unsteady, and their address too transparent for transparency's imperative. Shifting in the light of loss and reverence, reserve and exposure, Liu's sculptures give themselves to be seen as luminous remainders, artifacts of the constitutive confounding of the transparent technologies of Enlightenment's enclosure. Thank you.
Thank you, Genji. Our next speaker is Baseera Khan, an artist based in New York but born in Texas. They've had solo exhibitions at the Brooklyn Museum, and their works are included in the collections of the Whitney Museum and the Guggenheim Museum. They're currently a visiting artist faculty at Columbia University. Please welcome Baseera Khan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Reiko, for inviting me and including me in something so important. I've learned so much and I've met a lot of really wonderful people. So I wanted to start off by saying I'm interested in civil obedience because I think that that is what I've been taught to be in America. I grew up in Texas. there's a lot of public squares with interesting public art and sculptures in their city centers. I also grew up in Dallas, Texas, which is a place where every student of Walter Gropius has made a big and beautiful architectural space that usually houses artwork. So as I was learning how to be an artist, I understood that if I wasn't Richard Serra, then how could I relate? And so I think somehow I've kind of fractured my practice into so many different ways that I, in a way, have rendered myself invisible, but I think that I've made myself hyper visible. And in fact, that kind of has the same resonances. So what you're looking at here is the Standard Hotel, which is a work of art in and of itself. And the gateway that's in the shadow, that is a work that I had up on the Highline Park for about a year, from 2022 to 2023. So my beginnings of unpacking the idea of civil obedience is initially thinking about how public space and private space actually teach us, without saying anything, how to behave. Something as simple as a gateway, that you probably have many in Chicago, can tell us what people fought for our freedom, right? Or like organic floral symbols that teach us who has money and who doesn't have money. So I started thinking about the surface of the gateway as a portal and a transitional space, an inside and outside space, but I also thought about it as a place where I could think about what is colonial now. So I met with a lot of the department heads at the Highline and understood the horticulture department, the art department, the hospitality department. And so I started to take photographs of the shipping boxes that would come in and rendered those onto marble, granite, Corian. So that was the beginning stages of this work. So in my own way, I'm inverting the resonance of a typical surface of a gateway with something that people don't even think has power, which is the material research and the excavation of people from all different parts of the world, usually Black and brown communities, that are taking materials, and the global market begins from there. So do you imagine what this box is? What came in this box? This box called Pig. Does anybody know? Absolutely. So Pig is actually a company that clarifies air, and it provided a lot of security during COVID for the Highline. So you're absolutely right. They make many different products. So there's hidden comedy within my work, but you'll never know it unless you know me. I am Muslim, but I'm a bad Muslim. And obviously Muslims don't eat pig. So I wanted to put this slide in because I want you to understand, also materially what I'm invested in. I like track marks. I like the mark making, but I like the separation and sort of the fine line of where something begins and where something ends. So I'm interested in embroidery, embossment, relief as a way to communicate. Even though this is simply a bad rendering of a tree that is found on the Highline, for me, I feel like the way that I cut into the material is communicating something as well. I put these in because I'm usually doing lectures at universities in front of aspiring artists. And typically the way I would describe these slides is, how do you fund yourself in these public art projects? So, I use the same materials and the same cutouts, but I applied acrylic paint, and we fundraised through these plates. But actually, when I think about it even further, if you think about historically the idea of material and colonization, like Greek models like the David, for example, were indeed painted colorfully and were erased over time through modernization to become these pure white sculptures. So in a way, it's my own unconscious intervention in bringing that back to public art space. I was also, I have this idea about me being an archive. So on some level, I'm also pushing myself to go back to painting. I'm not going to be sharing that with you today because I only have 20 minutes. But this was sort of one of the first events that occurred in my studio where I was actually bringing paint back into the surfaces and materials of my work. So another body of work, there's so much to say here, by the way, but just get to know me. Another body of work is a series of columns that I kind of deconstructed or reconstructed. I don't know what the academic terms are, but I'm thinking about the columns that you would find on a bank or a church or a museum. So I kind of researched those. I spent some time in Italy, in Rome, and sort of understood that the ruins themselves are also a museum space, something to admire, something to remember imperial patriarchy from. So I thought I would make my own columns. However, I would gut the middle of it so that light could pass through it. And I would wrap the materials with another kind of form of power, which for me is rugs that are hand embroidered from Kashmir. Or they could be from Iran, or they could be from China, or they could be from Africa. For me, I was just thinking about the horizontal power in information and documents that have been embroidered or loomed on carpets for centuries, that are oftentimes just gutted from their histories and their cultural significance and seen as decorative or innate objects, oriental objects. So in a way, I'm wrapping power with power. This is at the Wexner Center. There's so much I can say about that center, but maybe I can talk to you about it over dinner. So the centers for me were really important because by eliminating material from the inside, I'm taking away a lot of the weight-bearing issues of the sculpture. These are also made out of architectural foam. So what I'm doing is I'm creating an object that's tenable for me to move in sections, but it's also in a way becoming quite the prop. So I wanted people to look at it as an item, as a theatrical prop, so that they could also then turn around and rethink the actual sculptures that you see and come upon in the public space. Again, I think the resin discs that I created for these projects was my way of coming back to color. And here's a detail of the hand embroidered rugs that I had made in Kashmir. Later on, I decided that the column should take more of, this is basically in reference to my body, in the span of my body. But then I was given an opportunity to actually make life-size colonnades. So the materials changed from resin and foam to plywood and scrim. I first came upon scrim because, as I said to you before, I learned about art through Art with a capital A in Texas. I spent a lot of time at the Shinati Foundation. And at the Shinati Foundation, one of the symposiums that I volunteered for was Robert Irwin. So I did learn quite a bit about ephemera and the material of space, because he would recreate entire rooms with just simply scrim. This is at the Moody Art Center. The show was called Wait on History. So the surface being pink was something that is very peculiar, and it just dawned on me yesterday after looking at everyone's contributions that Alan was one of my biggest supporters from the very beginning. That's kind of what he does, right? And we would talk about color and we would talk about material, and he would always make fun of me and say, you're going to be really poor because the only place that would want you is biennials. So he said a lot of mean things, actually. So maybe, Reiko, you could take the place of him now that he's up there doing good work. Because the show I just had in London that was a painting show, he hasn't seen, or seen as a human. Maybe he's seen it as an alien. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is this color was discussed heavily between me and Alan. And he never really brought up the artists or the research that he was doing. But we talked about a company that I was really interested in because I'm really interested in the histories of material. So whether I'm using hair or gold or silk from Kashmir, I am simply thinking about the placement of where these works go. The initial reason I made this body of work was because Meta came down from its own ivory tower and said, we're thinking about collecting sculpture. Would you like to make some work for our Moynihan building in Penn Station? So, you know, I really thought it was a great idea because I would imagine a lot of the people that come and who are employed at this building look very much like the people in this room. And they're very, you know, savvy, and they're creating AI monsters. And so as they're doing that, they're looking up at the sculpture, and the material of paint became really important to me. So I couldn't just fairly like go and to Home Depot with a swatch and be like, can you make this paint? I really put a lot of energy into thinking about where does the history of the paint exist. And Farrow and Ball is, you know, a very diplomatic paint. And the minute that the powers to be at Meta understood the company, they would tell me their stories about when they were growing up, their mother had a conniption because they couldn't find the right orange Farrow and Ball, blah, blah, blah. There were stories just coming in from families. We're talking about wealthy, wealthy families that come from Britain that were calling in and telling me their stories about the history of this particular paint company. So this kind of became the mission of these columns as a kind of quiet way of thinking about color and its significance. Sugar almond. It's kind of brown. So Bust of Cannon is a project that is similar but dissimilar. It's not about referencing a public architectural feature like a column or a gateway, but it's really thinking about another kind of public space, which is the catacombs of a museum where you keep all of the antiquities, which you may never see. So I did do a solo exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum, and one of the things they let me do was to access their antiquities. So an overarching theme of mine is understanding the fine line between surveillance and desire. I do believe those two are the same because you're using a face tuner to look better. Oh, you're using a face tuner to look better, but you're also using a face tuner to surveil people that will never know they're being surveilled, for example. So I wanted to body scan myself, and prepare my body in such a way that I was referencing antiquities, specifically goddesses that were empowered by like feminine beauty or protection. So I would find contemporary ways to emulate the armor that they would wear. And these are then scanned. And yeah, so instead of a sword to protect me, I used headphones and a baseball cap, for example. This is also my hair. You can release the shaft and paint with it if you, I won't let you do it, but I could do it. I'm going to kind of hurry up because I got the word. So you can see that I'm continuing to use these rays of light and these geometries to create depth and bring it back to the significance of the paint and the material. The plexiglass material is similar to what I would think of material research because it's made from oil, crude oil. I use crude oil quite a bit in my paintings. And I think about my body inscribed in such a way, especially after 9/11, growing up in Texas. So I do think about certain materials that are both seen as very expensive, but also an assault to my body when I'm making these works. So the plastic material itself is interesting because it is made out of crude oil and it has that kind of archival significance to my body as well. And very quickly, I'll end with Laws of Antiquity, which is similar to the busts, where I'm continuing to look at archival antiquities from the Brooklyn Museum. For example, the work at the very top becomes this illicit conversation between me and the conservator. This is, you know, so I'm able to take some of their antiquities and perform. This all happened on site at the museum. Rules and regulations around the works that are of our bodies. How are we doing on time? 2 minutes. Oh my. Any questions? Just kidding. We'll wait for that. 2 minutes is okay. Thank you.
Okay, our last speaker is, I have to say, I'm guessing, Tia Jojima, who is the curator of global contemporary art at the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. Their talk is called Queering Asian Diasporic Art in Brazil. Tia, please come to the stage.
So, hi everyone. Thank you for being here, and many thanks to the organizers for the kind invitation to participate in this excellent symposium. I'm truly honored to be here in conversation with all of you and to be meeting amazing people too, like this being very fun and energizing. So I want to begin by situating my positionality as a researcher and curator. I am part of the large Japanese diaspora in Brazil, and I'm saying that because a lot of people in the United States don't know that there are Asians in Latin America. I was born and raised in São Paulo, and I moved to the US to pursue my education in art history. I recently completed a PhD at the CUNY Graduate Center, where I wrote a dissertation on art, performance, and pornography in 1980s Brazil. My research was focused on recuperating histories of queerness and sexuality in the country with a commitment to challenging hegemonic frameworks that tend to privilege Euro-American perspectives. Why am I here? My engagement with the history of the Asian diaspora in Latin America began from a very from a deep personal need, a desire to understand and articulate my own history after a lifetime of not encountering those narratives within institutional educational settings. This pursuit eventually led to an exhibition that I co-curated with my friend Yuji Rafael, who is a fellow Japanese-Brazilian researcher and independent curator. Titled The Appearance, Art of the Asian Diaspora in Latin America and the Caribbean, the show was presented at the America Society in New York and featured the work of 29 artists. We organized the exhibition around the notion of appearance, using it as a critical lens through which to consider this artistic production in the region. And we utilized this artwork by Lidia Okumura, she's also Japanese-Brazilian, as the kind of guiding principle for the show, in which she's depicting this three-dimensional object coming into space little by little, resulting in a figure that occupies the space but remains almost invisible. So, and all the three artists that I'm going to be discussing here were included in this exhibition. So I've been in conversation with them for a while now. I bring my positionality here not only to locate myself within this event, but also to express my own sense of trepidation in occupying this space, given the fact that my previous academic research was mostly focused on queerness in 1980s Brazil. That said, there are meaningful parallels between the frameworks of queerness and diaspora, connections that have been theorized within Asian diasporic scholarship in the US. For example, Gayatri Gopinath's formulation of a queer diasporic reading practice offers a compelling way to make queerness legible within diasporic contexts. Similarly, the recent volume, Queering Asian Diaspora, edited by Laura Kina and Jan Christian Bernabe, presents essays that explore the intersections of queerness and diaspora, and texts that have been particularly generative for my own analysis of queer diasporic artists in Brazil. These intersections emerge in part for the shared tensions both queer and diasporic subjects experience in relation to normative ideas of nation-state, particularly within Western contexts shaped by heteronormative and white supremacist ideologies. Across different national contexts, both queer and diasporic subjects have disrupted these disciplinary ideals, resulting in shared histories of erasures, different forms and levels of marginalizations, as well as, experiences of it's supposed to be black. Pathologization, subjugation, and exclusion. As a Latin American art historian specializing in the histories of queer art in the region, I see my contribution to Asian diasporic discourse here in the US as a way of fostering more transnational and hemispheric dialogues around diaspora, building on the work of scholars like Margot Machida and Erica Lee. In particular, Erica Lee's concept of hemispheric Orientalism has been instrumental to my curatorial thinking, as she argues that anti-Asian racist ideologies, laws, and visual cultures circulated across the Americas, shaping Asian communities' experiences in both North and South America. And this was really important for our exhibition, to kind of bring Asian diasporic artists from 13 different countries under the same conceptual umbrella. In this light, integrating the Latin American context into the US Asian diasporic discourse allows us to deepen our understanding of transoceanic migration and its uneven legacies. Moreover, just as Asian American artists, activists, and scholars have critiqued the dominant constructions of Americanness, the very term Latin America likewise invite us to reconsider what America means, raising critical questions about whose histories and identities are included or excluded within this ideological and geopolitical framework. In this presentation, I focus on the work of three queer Asian diasporic artists from Brazil, Alice Yura, Caroline Ricali, and Dan Lee, through the lens of queer diaspora. I explore how their practices challenge fixed notions of gender and nationhood, and how they center the body, their own body, and those of other entities in their practices. Specifically, I examine their engagements with three major and often contested spaces for both diaspora and queerness: vision and visibility, home and the archive, and the boundaries between life and death. In the self-portrait Restos de Carnaval, that translates to Carnival Leftovers, Japanese-Brazilian artist Alice Yura poses in the reclining nude position, gazing at the camera. The artist is lying down on top of handmade rugs, common in Brazil, against a backdrop of cloth hanging from an improvised line that falls like drapery. The smudged blue makeup running over her cheeks symbolizes tears, adding to her melancholic gaze. Created during the COVID-19 pandemic, the photograph captures a moment of intense vulnerability. Yura, who is a trans woman, had paused her hormone therapy due to uncertainty surrounding the health implications of the therapy and the virus. During this time, she witnessed her body change dramatically, a development that became a profound source of dysphoria. The presence of body hair, emphasized in the image, marked one of the most difficult periods in her relationship with her body, worsening the sense of isolation brought on by the pandemic. Yura draws from the long art historical tradition of the reclining nude, specifically taking inspiration in Orientalist representation of the figure of the odalisque, a genre steeped in fantasies projected onto Eastern women's bodies. In her photograph, however, Yura, through her trans feminine body, disrupts this tradition. She displaces the viewer from a presumed Western colonial and potentially desiring and objectifying gaze by unsettling the normative representation of the female nude. Most importantly, Yura asserts agency in the self-portrait, consciously engaging with and reframing the legacy of Orientalist artworks that depicted Eastern women as passive and sexually available subjects or objects. Vision and visuality are central to Alice Yura's practice. Throughout her work, Yura has embraced the hypervisibility she experiences in her daily life as a trans woman, using it as a tool to assert more control over how she is seen and transforming visibility into a process of negotiation. In Conversation, the artist described photography as an antidote to a lifetime or being looked at and being heavily scrutinized in public and private spaces without any agency over those gazes. Through her photographs and performances, Yura reclaims this dynamic, carefully choreographing the terms of how she is seen and defining the precise ways in which people interact with her body. For example, in this performance, she's posing naked with QR codes imprinted on her body, and she's inviting viewers to come close with their phones and read information that is accessible through her body. In this way, the artist engages with and even plays upon the viewer's desires, whether that be sexual desire or scopophilic or visual desire, that is elicited through the artworks and experiences that she constructs. By doing so, she positions herself as an active agent within this relational dynamic, rather than a passive, objectified subject merely existing for the gaze of others. In the photograph Studio Yura 1, the artist also engages with, Photo Yura 1. The artist also engages with visibility, but this time bringing to the fore the triangulation of gazes implicit in the act of looking. Who is doing the looking and who is being looked at, in an image that also includes us, viewers, in this dynamic. The artist is sitting on a chair, posing to a photographer, who is her father, who is taking her picture, while wearing a red kimono that covers and enlarges her body. The photograph on the back wall depicts a man, who is her grandfather, in formal attire, looking steadily at the camera, just like she's doing. His image, hanging a little higher than the two figures in the room, unifies the scene. The scene brings different triangulations and relations, one between daughter, father, and grandfather, 3 generations in the same family sharing space, and another triangulation that is centered on vision that also includes us in the scene. The work draws attention to the act of looking as an always mediated and relational process. Vision and visibility in Yura's work are structuring framework that shape the artist's practice. Her work ultimately foregrounds the politics of vision, interrogating what we see, how we see, and how we are seen. Drawing on her family history, Yura situates her practice within a lineage of photography studios historically operated by male figures in her family. Her father, grandfather, and uncles, they owned vernacular commercial photo studios in Brazil. In engaging with this history, she queers and transforms this patriarchal and heteronormative legacy through artistic practice, pushing tradition forward. So home, now moving to Caroline Hicali. Home is a contested and complex idea for diasporic subjects. In the context of displacement, home carries multiple and often contradictory meanings, ranging from redemptive to oppressive, as it can mean homeland, country of residence, domestic space, community, and many other metaphors. Gayatri Gopina frames home as a structuring framework for the diasporic subject in relationship to which they develop their subjectivities. If we consider nation as home, then queer diasporic subjects often fall outside of these hegemonic conceptions of nationality that are shaped by heterosexuality and racial ideals defined by whites. And specifically in Latin America, in several Latin American countries, such as Mexico and Brazil, we have mixed race ideologies, what we call mestiçagem or mestiçaje, that imagine the nation as a mixture of white, indigenous, and Black populations that effectively excluded Asians and coexisted with anti-Asian ideology and rhetoric. Engaging with reimaginations of home and the domestic, Carolina Hicali, a non-binary Chinese, Japanese, Brazilian artist, explores materials found in their Chinese grandmother's house, including photographs, furniture, and clothing. In my reading of Lee's work, I adopt an expansive interpretation of home, which includes items from this family archive. Just as the nation as a home and its normative constructions of identity shape diasporic subjectivity, so too do family archives. Family photos carry symbolic power, enabling diasporic individuals to imagine and reconnect with a lost or inaccessible past, shaping their memories and experiences. And this is something that scholar Marian Hirsch argues in her scholarship. In the sculpture Twigs, Hicali suspends 7 black and white photographs printed on small pieces of cloth, hanging at the center of an ornamented wooden structure. Displayed frontally and linked by delicate metal chains, the images form a disconnected sequence. The wooden frame echoes the sinuous contours of a Chinese dragon, with stylized eyes, nostrils, and ears. The photographs, dating from the 1920s to the 60s, depict members of the artist's family from both her Japanese and Chinese heritage, captured across various times and places. Some of these depicted figures the artist recognizes, others remain unknown to them. Hicali is particularly drawn to these unidentifiable faces, choosing to include them as a way of resisting any fixed or conservative notion of family and ancestry. Embracing the gaps and the absences in this personal history, the artist reflects on a broader diasporic experience, one in which memory and identity are shaped as much by what is missing as by what is known. Wood, as a material, occupies a significant place in Caroline Hicali's sense of home. Wood was omnipresent in their grandparents' house, in chests, beds, flooring, altars, and other furnishings, imprinting itself onto the artist's affective understanding of domestic space. In their artworks, wood serves as a key material, which they describe as the skeleton of the works. By embracing Chinese ornamentation as this skeletal element, Lee confronts questions of authenticity, a fraught and persistent concern for many people in the Asian diaspora. Chinese visual culture was a distant reference for the artist who has lived their entire life in Brazil. However, Chineseness or Asianness have shaped how they were perceived as an Asian person in the country. Their experiences were forged through this paradox, where cultural markers felt both remote and imposed. Hicali's embrace of Chinese-looking ornamentation also challenges the art world's expectation of what their work should look like. In a conversation, they pose the question, is this work Asian enough? A provocation that speaks to the fraught terrain diasporic artists navigate, as their practices are often scrutinized for how authentically they represent their cultural backgrounds. By leaning into these visual elements, Lee not only resists these expectations, but also interrogates entrenched art historical categories such as Orientalism, Japanism, and chinoiserie, terms that denote the aesthetic appropriation of Asian cultures by Western artists, often in service of imperialist and colonialist agenda. Through this critical engagement, Lee reclaims and recontextualizes these forms, using them as a means to question the power structures that have long shaped the visual language of Asia in the West. If wood functions as the structural skeleton in Hika Lee's work, ceramics, and this is another example of a work prominently using wood and personal kind of archival, a family archive. So if wood functions as the skeleton in their work, ceramics and textiles would represent the flesh. To the artist, these are materials that embody personal memory and intimacy. Sewing these materials together is a way of repairing the past. In the work Pouring, a sculpture composed of 3 small-scale humanoid figures, Lee assembles a sandwich-like structure. Ceramic pieces clasp fragments of textiles delicately stitched together with red thread. The fabric pieces come from clothing the artist found in their grandmother's house, which were cut to mirror the shape of the ceramic figures. For the artist, sewing is a way of crafting fictions, of forging new relationships and kinships that help make sense of both the present and the future. Pouring, a work made entirely of archive as flesh, held together by delicate threads on the verge of breaking, reimagines the archive and the home not as a spaces of unfreedom or traditional femininity, but as sites of queer potential and imagination. So this is my final case study, and I promise this is going to be fast. I know, because there is the time. So spiraling upward through the central gallery of the Pinacoteca de São Paulo, a major museum in the country and in the city. Bags filled with organic matter create the artwork To Let Go, a monumental installation by Dan Lee, a non-binary Indonesian-Brazilian artist known for installations with organic matter. This living sculpture invites natural processes such as fermentation, decomposition, the emergence of fungi and insects as vital co-creative forces. Challenging museum spaces and their goals of preserving and protecting artworks from natural elements, Dan Lee's work is alive and constantly transforming. It's never fixed. With time, mold grows and bacteria metabolizes matter, expanding itself and filling the gallery space with the scent of rot. The rotten smell resulting from this process is fundamental in Lee's practice, as a way to make imperceptible processes that are usually invisible, as well as to open space to the abject and the undesired. The installation features fresh cut flowers and clay pots that look like urns, evoking death rituals. Yet, these elements are not merely aesthetic, they are essential to the work's ongoing transformation. The flowers gradually dry, while the clay pots filled with rice undergo fermentation, emphasizing the artwork's processual nature. In crediting the artwork, the artist states that the following beings are its protagonists: fungi, bacteria, plants, insects, invisible life, and unnamed entities. By attributing agency to all of these non-human organisms, Dan Lee challenges human supremacist ideologies that position humans as dominant over nature, and even over the very definition of life itself. In my interpretation of the artist's works, these unnamed entities also encompass ancestral and spiritual presences, invisible forces that continue to shape our lives, bridging our present with the past. Indeed, the core of Lee's practice is a radical queering and rethinking of the boundary between life and death. For the artist, life and death are part of the same process. Death is not the end of life, but a culturally constructed concept and an essential stage for rottenness to thrive. By foregrounding rot, decay, and decomposition, Dan Lee challenges the logic of cleanliness, productivity, and desirability pushed by capitalist society. In doing so, they create a potent metaphor for queer and diasporic experience: the unruly, undesirable, the excessive, and the non-normative. Here, rottenness becomes a site of regeneration and potentiality, a space where queerness and diaspora converge to imagine life beyond the sanctioned binaries of gender, nation, life, and death. In bringing together the works of these 3 artists in Brazil, my goal was to show how they challenge hegemonic and normative frameworks that, in some ways or others, have structured their queer and diasporic lives. In their practices, they carve space for alternative imaginaries rooted in negotiations of visibility, in complex views of home, and in expansive views of life and death. Their practices invite us to move away from fixed ideas of gender, sexuality, and nation, and embrace instead complexity, contradiction, and fluidity as essential ideas to thinking diasporic life. Thank you.
You to all the speakers. I invite them to the front to take a seat while I offer some kind of, summary. Please come to the front. I try to organize my thoughts into 3 categories because I think they lend themselves to this categorization. The first of which is maybe something like historiography and geography. I think listening to Genji's talk, it made me realize, and also in conversations with people in Asian American studies, there is a bit of a majority discourse within a minority discourse around Asian American studies, which has largely to do with the archival records of Chinese American and Japanese Americans. This is simply to say that Asian America is sometimes conflated with this incorrectly, but merely that, we can think of Japanese internment as this kind of meta-analytic point about where we are in terms of this scholarship. What do we think about incarceration? What do we think? This actually is kind of like the cutting edge of, the connection between East Asian and Asian American studies. Similarly, then, we have, I think, under-theorized, as Baseera and Tia point out, the South generally within this discourse, which is to say that Texas, for example, is probably the most Asian American place now in the United States. And when I say the South, I mean the South of the United States. I mean the rural South. I mean South and Southeast Asia. This is also kind of, within a minoritarian discourse, within a minoritarian discourse. And then Tia points out even further that we have to consider the actual South of America, in which there continue to be more diasporic communities that we have not even begun to think about. So I think just as a beginning point for the 3 of you to think, we are reaching, I think, a very advanced level of diasporic studies now because we can acknowledge all of these lacunae within our own efforts to fix initial lacuna. Second to that is materiality. Materiality is emphasized so strongly in these talks. And by that, I think most potently was this idea of transparency, but also the material histories of things. You can think about Lisa Lowe and the intimacies of 4 continents. So much of what we can talk about in a transnational context is the flow and backwards and forth movement of materials, material science. Sometimes that has to do with empire. A lot of the time it has to do with the empire, now that I think about it. But then, you can think about political histories of glass, political histories of resin, political histories of scrim, of, the word chintzy even, comes from this very racist way of describing South Asian textiles. So in that case, then, how can this inform our ideas of what monuments can be, what memorials can be, what materials are suitable for memorializing or monumentalizing this history that has always been sort of occluded or hypervisible at the same time? How does this then lead us to a properly transnational approach or something that transcends national border? And I think finally, I really loved Baseera's title of obedience, civil obedience, because I think this relates to some concept of normativity. So, and I think this is very potently related then to queer diaspora and the position of the body. I reprise again Soyun's question from the beginning of this day, which is, whose body? The artist's body, the audience's body, or, the Asian American body, however. Where is it shown? Does it need to be shown? And then within that, the body's position within certain patriarchal frameworks, which I think are very magnified in diasporic situations because of this kind of like, imbalance, at least in my personal experience, my family was literally the most important thing to my life in 20 years of living in the United States because they're like the only Chinese people I can spend time with. So, but that has this kind of confining relationship because the patriarchal, whether that's the home, the homeland, the nation state, all of these are things in which, queer diaspora contends with and tries to carve out some kind of proper existence for itself. So those are merely my framing questions, and I invite any of you to respond in what way you see fit.
Should we start like in order of questions about like historiography and geography? Okay. Well, I want to emphasize again my trepidation of being here because, because I'm not like an Asian American scholar, etc., or Asian art scholar, but at the same time, you mentioned, you know, we are in this kind of, I don't necessarily agree that we are in this advanced level of diasporic studies because the Latin America is not even studied. It's completely understudied. There are very few exhibitions on the Asian diaspora in Latin America and the Caribbean. In the United States, I can count them with like one hand. And scholarship is even less than that. Like most of the published scholarship is looking at post-war abstract painting practices, like we have in the United States, but very little is focused on conceptual artists in the 60s and 70s who are grappling with dictatorship and who are also Asian diasporic, or even like more contemporary practices. Another big difference in terms of historiography, for at least in the case of Brazil and different countries in Latin America, is that Asian diasporic studies, they are not as, they didn't develop from activism and university departments as they developed in the United States in the late 60s. So the artists who were creating in that period and after that, they were not creating looking at that kind of framework, political and activist framework. They had other things going on, but they were not looking necessarily at this kind of identitarian sources and struggles. That was the case of the United States. So I would love to develop more historiography and exhibitions linking United North and South to expand these discourses, but at the same time being aware of this like distinctive sources and frameworks for artists in the South. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chie. And thanks for your framing. It feels like where Chie has begun is kind of helpful because a lot of what I'm trying to think about, but also what I feel was present sort of in everybody's presentations, is when in these institutional settings, what is expected for us to perform and produce is a record or account of that which has not been seen, right? Oh, like, you know, as you're saying, there's almost no existing, record, let's say, in the art world for an art history, especially in international context with an understanding of the Asian diaspora in Brazil or something like that. As you're kind of suggesting, you could count on your hand a certain number of works. And there are a series of questions and a series of histories that come out in your work, and also that you're excavating in sort of archival collections materials that you want to, in some ways bring into view, and perhaps you're drafted or conscripted into that role by some folks who are, I think we talked yesterday about like ways in which like we know that our narratives or propensity or capacity to produce a narrative are being operationalized or being used, something like that. And I want to comment in sort of my sort of expected role for that. It's also true that, the Asian American art history on the East Coast, more or less of the United States, or actually east of California, is more or less non-existent for art historians, for Asian Americanists. It's really, my grandfather would be like artist number 2 or maximum number 3 of a generation or 2 of Asian American artists on the East Coast who are practicing, even who sometimes have like anomalous exhibition records and were seen and stuff like that. It's really like Isamu Noguchi. If you're an art historian or something, it's Yasuo Kuniyoshi, and then there's a full stop for my grandfather's generation, which is sort of Abex generation, and for the next generation until you get to the lifting of certain immigration restrictions in 1965, and then maybe there's a little bit more in art history after that for folks who are immigrating after that, more or less. There's sort of small exceptions to that rule. Mineo Okubo, who ended up on the East Coast in New York. But just to say, I think that, yeah, we're all in a position in certain ways of engaging narratives that are, submerged in some way, but we're in a position to ask a different question than the question of how can we introduce our narrative into a system whose optics function not just to make it not visible, but also function to, harm it, do it damage, and operationalize it for ends that we are not excited about, and that maybe a lot of these artists, including ourselves, are totally arrayed against, have a beautiful other way of thinking about another world that they're trying to produce. I guess I'll sort of pass it off to Baseera by saying, for me, the transparency is a figure like any other. It can do some things for us. Maybe it can't do some things for some people. But for me, it helps immediately be a place in which to recognize, okay, so if we understand on like a broad sort of like distribution of death, racial order level, Asians and Asian Americans are in a position to mediate a certain colonial exercise of power, a certain operation of violence between blacker and browner folks and white folks. If we can start immediately from a question, well, it's not that they're invisible. I mean, they're functioning in various roles, actually, often to mediate between these two places. So to start from a question about power instead of a kind of false binary, oh, we don't have power, or we do have power. Okay, there are certain kinds of power that we have, and power also moves through us. But then once we've understood that that's happening, it's not just about saying, complicity, great. It's about saying, okay, well, what kinds of operations at the level of racial form and at the level of aesthetic form happen in that place of mediation? What is it that we do and make possible and transform in that space as that power moves through us, and how are, as we are, made transparent to that power, in certain ways not seen, in other ways we can refract that, we can distort that, make something else happen. I'll pass it off to Baseera.
Okay. How can I respond to you both and to the public? I can start off by saying I think of myself as a bridge. I feel like I'm a part of you all, but I also feel like a unicorn. Maybe we all feel that way. But, I'm South Asian and East African. And so that kind of dilutes things. I live in America as what my body presents. So I think I look South Asian. And I am South Asian. So I think when you were both talking, I wanted to become the case study. I'm very smart, by the way. It's just that I think that there's some problems with academia, as, bell hooks would say. I did foundational undergraduate school in the art program at UNT in Denton, Texas. It was right before the internet. We had the internet, but I had to go to North Denton, where all the rich kids were, and wait in line with my friends, wait for the sound, right? And they had to go look at all their weird things before I could look at my stuff. So all that to say is, I went to the library with my friends to do the whole like swipe left, swipe right with the books. That's how I learned about art. The teachers, God bless them, identified me as Asian, as I am, and said, well, you should make paintings that are grotesque. In my reference as a person who's embodied in the way I look, apparently to be a painter, I have to paint fragmented bodies. I have to paint the grotesque. And it has been the word that has followed me to date, like 2025. Now, in the reference of learning in Denton, Texas, pre and post 9/11, because it happened while I was in school, the 9/11 bit, I was taught about Shazia Sikandar, Shirin Nishat, Ghada Amir, many other artists like Kara Walker, you know, there's other artists, but these were the artists that they wanted me to fashion myself against. Now, I will tell you, to keep it short, what actually made me want to pursue art. Not that I don't highly respect those artists that I was being shown, but it actually happened off campus. There is this very interesting and wealthy man who is friends with Richard Meyer. And Richard Meyer built this building for him in North Dallas, right across the street from the man who owns the Dallas Cowboys. And if you didn't know, the man who had owned the Dallas Cowboys was allergic to trees and grass. So it was a zero-scaped mansion. So this man, Howard Rachofsky, who happens to be one of the wealthiest and most admired collectors in the United States, sat down and told me one day, as a student looking at his work, why he decided to put a very large Jeff Koons between his eyesight at his house and the Dallas Cowboys. It was like an interracial war, you know, between the two of them. But that's actually not the story I want to tell you. I just thought that would be fun to share. Now, I don't know if you guys know anything about the weather patterns in Dallas, Texas, but there's a lot of torrential downpour, lots of rain. And actually, I grew up being in fear that the electricity would turn off because it was really bad, where it was a lot of rain. So you would think that someone like Howard Rachofsky would have generators and lots of things to fortify their beautiful home. However, they didn't. And when I was visiting, he told me and the other colleagues of mine the story about how he had bought a Mark Quinn. So Mark Quinn, as an Asian artist, was the person who I learned about and decided to become an artist. Mark Quinn had collected his own blood over a long period of time and made a copy of his hand. It just looked like this. He made a latex copy of his hand and he filled it year by year with blood that he would prick from his fingers. So basically what he ended up with was a copy of his hand, indeed with his own blood. And it was a refrigerator set inside the Rachofsky's collection. One night, there was a huge storm, no generator, and the hand melted all over the floor. All over the floor. When I heard that story, I knew that I needed to be an artist. So that is how I entered into the scene. It was not the other artists that I was taught in the university. And I feel like you guys are smart enough to know how that case study fits into what you're both saying.
Beautiful. And just want to, I like wonder if where you've sort of brought us with that can like open, or it has opened something. So I'm just responding to it. Fred Moten has this like phrase about violence in the archive. And there's a way in which I love the way that you're describing how what made you want to be an artist was actually the way in which this artist had, somewhere between failed to, refused to enter the archive, but more so than that, which obviously that's this idea about, you entered or you didn't enter, you succeeded or you failed, is this kind of like polar logic, which is the same as the visible, invisible, logic. But what happened was something else, which is that this artist, like, I don't know, corroded, defaced, engaged, got involved in this collection in a very different way. And you were like, that's what I'm trying to do. And that just seems like, I think in a certain way, I think I felt that in a lot of the ways that your work is engaging in thinking about history without any interest of like representing it for the purposes of it being, collected as like a post-colonial example, or you're talking about the problem of the figure of the fragment and its attribution to the so-called post-colonial or the immigrant subject, and it's like, there's a rich aesthetic history like around the idea of the fragment, that people have thought about, and I'm glad people thought about the idea of the fragment, and we can talk about this. But obviously, how fleshed out or compelling is the idea of the whole, and then what does it have to do with the idea of the part, and then the fragment, what is that in relation to a part? It sounds like it's often, to me, the relegation of the idea of, let's say, a displaced person or a history that is somehow decentered, and then it's a shorthand for no actual intellectual engagement with how it is that would work, would be the name fragment. The fact that you're Asian, but you're in America, you're South Asian, which is, displaced even within Asian American studies and within Asian America as a category. That's a fact. But then what is fragmentation exactly lend us as a critical apparatus for that? And what does it mean that it's white people who are telling you, oh, you're probably fragmented? Like, I read about you guys, like, we're really like complete, but then you guys, it's like a fragmented situation. So I just think this question about how to do something different in and with, an archive, or how to think differently, about what an archive is and how it functions as a place to start from, both for our, so-called like institutional, interventions, but also as something that maybe we each know anecdotally from our practices that far exceed whatever it is that we happen to be representing for an institution, Asian American studies, and an Asian American artist, this kind of thing, an Asian American curator working on. I'll pass it off to you, but I think your exhibition, which I got to also see you speak about, the appearance, creates a similar kind of set of questions about how one does more than just appear within an archive, arrive within an archive, get acquired, pass it off to you on that.
Thank you for the for this tie with the exhibition. It was really challenging to define the framework of appearance to look at the production of 29 artists across 13 different countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, from 8 different countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, etc. We really wanted to be respectful and not superimpose any kind of like Asian diasporic artists will create works that are grotesque, that are fragmented, that are about this, that have the Chinese look, etc. And it was a very big negotiation with the institution and people that were expecting to see that. And shockingly, not so shockingly, but so that's why we came with this framework of appearance that can mean so many different things, and it always implies a negotiation. Appearance and disappearance, and visibility and invisibility is always part of the artist's agency and negotiating their own appearance and existence in the world. And I think that there are a lot of parallels with your own ideas of transparency versus invisibility. What I wanted to ask you is your thoughts about Asian diasporic artists often being seen through this negative lens, of like invisibility or silence or death, etc.
That's going to have to count as our question, because we are at time. So you're free to answer such a question, but we cannot take any from the audience.
Oh, sorry. No, then no.
Maybe we can try to combine it or something like that. Let's take a question from the audience and let's see how that can be put in relation.
Has to be one amazing question that totally summarizes everything.
It doesn't have to be anything. Is there a second microphone, or do I pass this to you guys? Okay.
Okay. Hi. I am interested in this concept of the Asian diaspora, and I very quickly just now looked up which states actually have the most in population, and I'm embarrassed that we have all forgotten Hawaii, which is more than 50% Asian now and working its way up. So talk about being invisible. The state that is off to the east of California. I have no idea what's going on there. I have a nephew who lives there, but I have no idea what's going on with the art world. Next place is California. And one of the reasons that I'm surprised by California is that I am familiar with Angel Island, which was the West Coast version of Ellis Island. People spent an hour and a half in Ellis Island. They spent weeks to months in Angel Island because California so did not want any more Asians. But while they were there, people left incredible poetry on the walls, which later were painted over. And then this now in modern day created a conflict between the historical preservationists who want to leave the buildings the way they were and the artists and the art historians who want the paint taken off so they can read the poetry. So entirely different. And I had not really thought. It's interesting to look at the map and see like a little community here, a little community there, and so on and so forth. And is there connection? Is there connection between these communities?
Thank you. So I'm going to try to like combine all of these things and pass it off to Baseera to make for like the last words that comes back around one more time. So so I feel like, and maybe I'll pose it actually as a question in a way to you about your practice. I think that both for changing ideas about Asian diasporic identity, but also Asianness in the United States, in terms of this problem that Chia was bringing up around negativity, positivity, right? Which again, that's the same kind of fundamentally, ultimately, that's the same kind of inclusion, exclusion thing. But at least we can think about operations of negativity as being not only about sort of yes, no, okay? But this negativity question, framing so often, a framing figure for Asian American or Asian diasporic histories is, loss, melancholy, silence, wound, this kind of stuff, which I think there's, a lot there that can be actually very exciting, to work with conceptually, theoretically. At the same time as that's happening, we are, seeing ways in, a kind of positivity at the level of thank you, at the level of the appearance of certain Asian American representability, not just the transformation of grief into grievance, not just the fact that all of a sudden anti-Asian violence can be written about or spoken about or engaged, that can be represented politically. So not just this kind of appearance, but also this idea that because of growing populations of folks of Asian descent in different parts of the United States, that's somehow on a representational political level involves an entitlement to participation. And so, what is Asian American studies after critical mass, or what is, Asian American identity after critical mass, which engages this question about, Hawaii, majority Asian American, what does that mean? So we get this kind of minoritarian problem, which I'm going to reflect across the diasporic so-called mainland homeland border, where there's a lot of elision in the question of diaspora, of expats who maybe are elites of their country who come and visit to study at, an art capital like New York or Paris and then go home, an elision between that and lives of immigrants who come to this country and live a racialized existence. So these are folks who are majoritarian where, at home, and then they show up here and they're minoritarian, and then maybe that changes their experience or understanding of themselves or their art, or maybe it doesn't. There are all of these kinds of questions. I want to ask, I guess, Baseera to send us off for her work around this question of sort of this, representability, negativity, positivity problem, not only in relation to the figure in your work, right? Because you are engaging these sort of like representations of these individuals, histories, questions, and then you're, affecting these figures, but they don't feel to me to be, fragmented. They don't appear to me to be grotesque, but I feel like your work maybe can speak to this negativity, positivity problem for Asian American studies, Asian American history, historiography.
I'm going to exercise, organize that prerogative. Let's talk that over lunch. Yes. Is that okay?
Yes.
You want to talk?
Can I just say, civil obedience is the answer. If we continue to follow policy as it is, we will be divided, my dear. So how about we talk about that over lunch?
Thank you so much to our amazing panelists, Baseera, Genji, and Chie, and thank you to Yechen Zhao today.